Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. Today we want to talk about motivation. What gets us going? What are the kinds of things that have us reaching out for success and having us reach out for the next level? We were introduced to a really interesting model around this concept of motivation. It was introduced to us by being called the 6 sermons. And the reason why is this concept that when you are giving a sermon, and ostensibly if you are giving a sermon, you're trying to motivate people into action or persuade them into something. But when you're giving a sermon or a talk, there are 6 elements that you want to make sure that you weave into your sermon or your talk. So this motivational structure, this model, was introduced to us being called the 6 sermons. But really what they are is just a really simple way of recognizing the different ways that people are motivated. And the application can be either for self-motivation, if you're trying to get yourself to get to the next level, what are the different ways that we can motivate ourselves by identifying which of these 6 styles of motivation strike us. Or if you're somebody who is in a position of responsibility over other people, and you're trying to get, say, employees or children or somebody in your life motivated. What are the different styles of motivation that will speak to them? So we want to unpack this model, this motivational model called the 6 sermons, and talk about some of the application in your personal and professional life.
Yeah, the model is broken into 3 major categories, and each of these categories has an away from and a toward orientation. So if you imagine 3 categories and each one has 2 variations of each of those categories, and we'll explain this in more detail in a minute here, but let me go ahead and go over the 3 categories first, and then we'll talk about all the details of how it looks away from and toward in its orientation. So the first category is power. Power is a big motivator for a lot of people, and power can have either an away from motivator or a toward motivator. The second category is affiliation. Affiliation, where it's social connections, affiliating with people. It's very people-centric. It can also have an away from motivator orientation or a toward motivator or orientation. And then the third category is achievement, actually achieving things, accomplishing tasks, making something in the outside world, or accomplishing something in your life. And this, again, can have either an away from orientation or a toward orientation.
Yeah, think of that away from or toward orientation as sort of like a carrot or stick orientation. Away from is more the stick and toward is more the carrot. And so all of these categories, when they are focused on the away from orientation, will be a form of fear or basically like a fear like something bad's going to happen. And then all of the orientations that are toward, think of them more like desire or hunger for whatever that is.
So let's talk about power. Let's start here with power, and we'll go into 2 different versions of power away from and power toward. So when we talk about power away from people, if you're motivated as a person or somebody in your life that you know is motivated as a person by power and being power away from, basically what this person is trying to accomplish, there's a fear here, a core fundamental fear that other people are going to have power over them or control them. And so a power away from person, basically, they don't play nice. They don't play nice in any kind of hierarchy structures. They don't play nice with the chain of command, per se. They're these, the people in life, and you might be one of these people, that just doesn't like to fall in line. You're always outside the system. You try to break systems. If somebody tells you something to do something, you almost will do the opposite because you want to be rebellious at your nature, at your core. Oftentimes, you're dealing with a power away from person, someone that just doesn't want to be under anyone else's thumb. And this looks on the surface like they're outside of the system. What often happens is they also can't step into positions of leadership oftentimes because they're outside of any hierarchy because they don't want to be under anyone. They also have a difficult time being over anyone in a hierarchy structure. So it's difficult for them to want to tell other people what to do. You'll see power away from people being very isolated in their work. Sometimes they like to just be left alone. They're solo workers. They don't play nice on teams usually. They don't like to be in charge or be in management position. They don't like to have anybody over them either. And this can be the hallmark, the core tenets of a power away from person. Now contrast that with someone who's power toward. Someone who's power toward obviously understands and appreciates hierarchy and structure. So oftentimes this person may not be in charge. They may not be the manager of something or be the CEO or the boss, but they love being in the chain of command, somewhere on the continuum of the chain of command. They have no problem being under somebody, and they have no problem being over somebody. They almost instinctively get hierarchy and how the chain of command works. And in fact, they seek out positions of authority and seek out people in positions of authority. They have no problem being in that structure. So you can kind of see the difference between somebody that's power away from and power toward in a motivational aspect.
Right. And so what are the kinds of things that would motivate somebody who's power away from? And what are the kinds of things that would motivate somebody who's power toward? Well, power toward's a little easier. You reward people who are power toward by giving them greater responsibility over others, giving them domain, essentially. So the carrot is, if you do really well, you could get promoted to management, or you could get promoted to lead. And so that's a bit of an easier style of motivating an individual who's power toward. But power away from is a little trickier, because you're trying to motivate somebody by not being able to give them, the standard, if you work really hard and you could get into management, is not going to work for a power away from person. So the kinds of things that you use to motivate them are things like autonomy. If you do really well, nobody will be breathing down your neck. You'll be able to work on projects alone. We'll be able to give you things all by yourself and just assume that you're getting them handled. Once we have established trust, now you won't have any micromanagers over you. That's a big one in a business context. But if you are a power away from person as an individual, then how do you motivate yourself? And oftentimes there's a little bit of like an anarchistic bent here. A lot of times a power away from person will get motivated by believing that they can show problems in a system, that they can be the person who's pointing out, how the man is getting you down. I think of people who are like people who create documentaries. Now, obviously, creating a documentary requires an entire team. It's very complex. There's going to be a lot of, orchestration of other people in those teams. But at the same time, your goal is to point out maybe something that's sick or wrong in a hierarchy structure. So you get motivated by finding these missions. You get motivated by being able to point out something that's going wrong in hierarchical structure. So as a self-motivating technique, this idea of, reaching out for what you want, showing how something could be a problem that other people are just blindly accepting. This could be a power away from motivator as an individual. Whereas as a power toward person, if you're trying to motivate yourself, recognizing that the better you do, the more you hone your skills or the more you go after, you could be in a position of influence. You could be in a position of leadership where other people listen to you and want to follow you.
So the second category, motivator, like we mentioned before, is affiliation. And again, affiliation is very people-centric. It's about affiliating, literally, with other people. And you can have an away from motivation here or a toward motivation. Now, because the frame is affiliation, people are important. It's not that away from affiliation people don't like people and they isolate themselves away from people. That's what you might be tempted to think at first. What it actually is how are they motivated inside of that main category of motivation? And basically, look at it like this. Someone who is away from affiliation motivated has kind of a fundamental fear underneath everything that they're going to be isolated from the group. They fear not being part of the group. They fear, and what this manifests in our modern social circles, we don't literally take people in our tribes and throw them out of the little tent city that we build on the on the Great Plains or anything like this. We actually embarrass people or censure them publicly. And that's usually how this shows up for people who are affiliation away from motivated. They're fearful or terrified of being pointed out, of being made fun of, about being embarrassed, about their reputation taking a hit publicly. So for example, I know a business owner who has an employee that is not performing at their best. And I've encouraged this business owner to basically let this employee go, fire them and say, it's not working out. But the fear is, because this person is away from affiliation motivated, the fear is that if they let this person go, they'll talk bad about this business and the business owner in the community and embarrass them socially. So the motivation to keep this employee on board is an affiliation away from motivation of being embarrassed in the town that this business is in. So that's how affiliation away from motivation looks in the real world, or can look in the real world. And contrast that with affiliation toward motivation. These are people who very much want to be tied into the social fabric. They want status. They want recognition. Whereas affiliation away from, they just want to do their job or be in the social circle. They don't want to rock the boat or make anyone, they don't want to stand out because they could be embarrassed by standing out. The affiliation toward motivated person loves to stand out. They love the status of being high status in the group. They love the adoration and love walking into a room, hey, so-and-so. And they love the recognition. I think of the movie Wag the Dog. And if you haven't seen this movie, I'm going to give you a spoiler alert at the very end of the movie. It's from the 90s, so hopefully you've seen it by now. If not, you might want to pause because I'm about to spoil the movie for you. The movie basically is this politician needs help. He's losing ground, so he hires a filmmaker to make a fake war on film. He creates a movie, like a documentary and a big media campaign of a fake war to try to get him out of political trouble. And at the end of the movie, obviously because he's doing this for a politician, the real nature of what will happen behind the scenes can never be known to the public. The filmmaker can never get credit for making this movie because it would ruin the frame the politician created and the illusion the politician created to everyone of this fake war he created. At the very end of the movie, it ends with Dustin Hoffman, who is the filmmaker, screaming at the politician saying, I want the credit. I don't care about the money. I don't care what you can provide me. I want people to know that I had my hand in this. I am the one that made this thing, and I want other people to know that. That's going to boost my reputation. It's going to make me feel really good as a person. And obviously, well, I'll let you see the movie to see what happened. But this producer was just demanding the credit. And obviously the politician can't give that to him because it would ruin everything. But this is an example of an affiliation toward motivator in the system we're talking about.
Yeah, what's interesting about contrasting the affiliation away from and the affiliation toward is that I've noticed that affiliation away from people don't necessarily have a big group of friends because they're motivated by wanting to avoid something. They're motivated by wanting to avoid awkwardness or embarrassment or lowering their status. Sometimes they tend to isolate themselves a little bit so that they can just withdraw from the game, right? Like if you don't have a lot of people that you have direct feedback about what's your status or reputation or, whether or not you're getting credit for something. If you don't have a lot of feedback around that, then you're in a neutral zone. So you don't have to worry about that. So sometimes affiliation away from people can actually be a little bit isolationist. Whereas I've noticed that affiliation toward people usually do have a big group of friends, or they have a big social group or tribe or people that they really want to hang out with a lot because they're they need a status structure to fit themselves in. They need to have a group of people that will be giving them credit if there's ever an opportunity to get that. So even though both are affiliation, they don't necessarily operate the same way. One goes away from people and one goes toward people. So then how do you use this model or this understanding of affiliation away from and affiliation toward to motivate others and yourself? Well, if you know somebody who is affiliation away from, one of the easiest ways is to make sure that you're checking in with them on a regular basis to say that that they're doing a good job. Words of affirmation are pretty big for them. And so making sure that you're regularly going, hey, you did well there. Now, this is not so much about credit as it is checking in with them on a regular basis so that they don't have to feel anxious or worried. It's about placating them and making sure that they know that they're doing okay. Whereas an affiliation toward person is motivated not just by words of affirmation, but words of affirmation in mass. So something like a party. A party might actually embarrass an affiliation away from person, but a party is a great idea to an affiliation toward person.
Think about a celebrity roast. An affiliation away from person would be mortified and would run for the hills in a celebrity roast situation. But someone that's affiliation toward would love being made fun of publicly in a fun way in a roast because it feels like the whole group is supporting them and it's giving them credit and recognition.
Yeah, you have to be at a certain status level in order to get a roast. So just getting a roast tells you that you're in a good position. Whereas, just like you said, an affiliation away from person would be mortified by the concept. So for an affiliation away from person, if you are affiliation away from, recognizing that those words of affirmation, that positive feedback, so that you know that you're at least a homeostatic level, that is really important. So asking people for what you need, asking people, and this is something that we all need to get better at, no matter what our motivational style is, no matter where we're at in life, asking for what we want, but checking in with people and going, hey, can you let me know if we're okay? Make sure that we're doing well. And then if this is a prime mover for you, then one of the worst things you can do is be isolationist. I mean, that's a tendency because you don't want to have to get negative feedback. However, one of the best things you can do is start to create a tribe. Get people around you where that you recognize that they could be giving you negative feedback. And so you're doing what you can to avoid that. Like, it moves you into action. It gets you doing the things you know you should be doing. Maybe development, maybe reaching out for a goal, maybe doing better at your job, because you're not in isolation. You actually are surrounded by potential feedback. So it motivates you to want to do the best job you can.
The third motivator is achievement. Achievement people want to make an impact or avoid looking like a failure and not making an impact. So an away from motivated achievement person, the greatest fear is trying something and it not working, failing at achieving the goals that they want to achieve. So oftentimes people are very nervous to try something new. An achievement person that's away from will probably try the tried and true. They'll do something that's proven, that's already been done, follow templates. These are ideas that will keep them on track from looking like they've failed at something. And if the failure happens, then they can say, well, I just followed the template. That's why the failure happened. It wasn't me. I didn't fail. It was the system that broke down.
Right. Alternatively, it can look like just working your brains out in order to make sure you don't fail.
True. Achievement toward people, however, if you're motivated by being achievement toward, you also can be working your brains out. And it's not even so much about recognition, like for affiliation people, or having control or power, like a power person. It really is about getting the thing done, about feeling good in your accomplishments and feeling pride about being able to make something happen, about achieving something in the world or in your life. And so you can see the difference between an away from person here who either works themselves to the bone just so they don't fail. They do everything. They try to be that perfectionistic person. They're constantly in motion so they can't fail. You know somebody like this in your life. You may even be like this also. Or they're looking to, instead of not being fearful about failing, they actually want to achieve, and they'll be pushing themselves to be achievement oriented. And sometimes this can lead to not having to work that hard because they found leverage points, they've delegated, whatever that might be, but they're achievement toward, and it's about accomplishing the goal, very goal oriented type people.
No, that's a good point. Achievement away from people can get quite perfectionistic, and it can be crippling, even though it's a motivator. It can be almost like a counter motivator. And if you feel like you're going to fail, it can prevent you from reaching out for bigger things. Now, achievement people, what's interesting is that just like a power person, whether or not they're over others or whether or not they have somebody over them is generally what speaks to power people. And affiliation people, it's how big is their social circle, how much can they make sure that they are plugged into a tribe, and what kind of feedback they're getting from that, that group, that tribe, the people around them. And that could be just like workmates. For achievement people, it's generally about the tools they're using to get a job done. Tools are very important to achievement people. So if you're, say, an employer and you want to encourage or motivate an achievement person, I always think of things like, you've got a graphic artist on your team. They're not going to really care about whether or not they end up, if they're not a power person, they don't really care about whether or not they're going to end up in management. And they don't really care about that party you could be throwing them, but they would love to get that uber awesome monitor for the computer, like that huge monitor where now they can like really zoom in on every single pixel in Photoshop as they're doing their graphic work, right? The graphic arts work. So tools are a massive motivator to achievement people, and getting them, encouraging them and motivating them with the right tools is huge. Now, I'm an achievement person, and I've noticed that if I don't have the right tool for a job, I'll procrastinate it endlessly. But if I have the opportunity to go purchase myself a better tool for that job, and that includes things like housework, like the kitchen floor has always been something that I just absolutely loathe cleaning. I hate cleaning the kitchen floor. But as an achievement person, I wouldn't bought myself this like really cool vacuum like mop thing. It's kind of like a shark. It's like a steam cleaner. So it not only vacuums, but also steam cleans at the same time. And it was a bit of an investment, but my God, our kitchen floors are so clean now because I have the right tool for the job. So for an achievement person, if you want to motivate yourself, it's oftentimes about going ahead and investing in the tools that will make your job easier.
So the application of this has a lot of application. You can use this model and this framework to look at business. We've applied it to some business frameworks here. We've talked about if you have an employee and you're wanting to motivate them, that's a great tool to use in business. Also, anytime you're dealing with people, you've got any kind of social interaction with two people, you might be, let's say, a power away from person dealing with an affiliation toward person. The words you use and the things that motivate the two of you are going to be very different. So let's say you're married to somebody that's a different motivator than you, and you're speaking your motivational language, it's going to fall on deaf ears for that person. And then they speak their motivational language, it's falling on deaf ears for you. So just identifying this is a great starting point for yourself, for self-motivation, and then for people that you're in relationships with, your friends, your family, your coworkers, your boss, your employees, all those different structures. It's great to just say, oh, people are coming at their motivations from a different place. I see that. And then also it can be applied to communicating with people. Oftentimes, when you give a public talk, I think Antonia alluded to this at the beginning of the podcast, you're giving a talk or you're writing something, if you can hit each of the language that each of these 6 motivators use in something you're writing or speaking, you're going to appeal to the people's motivation in that group that are listening to you, or your audience, or the person that's listening to you for that matter. So this has a lot of application, a lot of places it can be used. But I think the first place is to start understanding where you're at personally. What motivates you? Are you a power away from, toward? Are you affiliation away from or toward? Or are you achievement away from or toward? We probably have a lot of these in our personality, but we probably prefer one or two mostly, similar to like a love language. So we have access to all of them, but we prefer one strongly and probably have a second, almost like a co-pilot per se, in our motivation. So what are you? I think that's a really good thing to identify first. And let's talk a little bit about something we've identified in almost like a progression or a healthy expression of some of these. I think there are varying degrees of unhealthy expressions and healthy expressions of each of these motivators.
Yeah, the anarchistic power away from person isn't nearly as healthy as the person who is seeking autonomy. And the power toward person who will step on anybody's toes to get to the top is not nearly as healthy as the power toward person who wants to lead through example and lead by being, the ability to perspective shift and be kind and generous to the people that they're leading. So obviously there are healthy and unhealthy expressions, and then making sure that for whichever style that you most resonate with, you're at the highest level of health. An affiliation away from person who isolates themselves is not nearly as healthy as an affiliation away from person who surrounds themselves with people and potential negative feedback. An affiliation toward person who's all about status, right? Like that person is not going to be nearly as healthy as the affiliation toward person who's about generating a tribe that gets everybody's needs met. An achievement away from person who doesn't do anything and procrastinates and is a perfectionist and beats themselves up all the time is not nearly as healthy as an achievement away from person who uses a sort of that in the back of their mind fear of failure to motivate them to work super hard. Right? Like the working really hard piece is obviously going to be a lot more healthy than the procrastination and do nothing. And then the achievement toward person who wants to make an impact, who wants to make sure that they can rely on themselves and use this as a sign of competence and self-reliance is going to be a lot healthier than the person who just wants to win and prove that they're superior to other people. So there's going to be healthy and unhealthy expressions of each of these motivations. And having your finger on the pulse of that, which one do you favor, and then which expression do you have? Do you have more of the healthy or unhealthy? And there's one more piece too before we wrap up. This idea of the toward and away from, like this is a very base carrot and stick concept, and our I would say our philosophy, right? Like we don't know this to be true, but our suspicion is that being toward motivated is probably a healthier expression than being away from motivated. Because the away from motivations are all around something embedded in fear. Now, there are healthy fears, right? Like the healthy fear of predators is obviously a healthy fear. So it's not like fear is always unhealthy. But living with fear, living with stress and fears around failure or being like, under somebody's boot or that you're going to have a bad reputation. These styles of fear are generally not serving us. They generally just add stress when we don't know these fears are actually going to play out. So our opinion is that a toward motivator is generally a little healthier. It's generally healthier because it's more of an expression of desire and hunger. It's sort of like in the previous podcast when we talked about self-acceptance versus self-improvement or self-development. You can come to growth and personal development through the lens of constant dissatisfaction, or you can come to it through a lens of wanting to reach out for something better. And a toward motivator is more the latter. It's more about wanting to reach out for something better. Whereas an away from motivator is a little bit more rooted in a dissatisfaction or a fear around something. So if you find yourself to be away from motivated, ask yourself if this is because you might be in a position or a mentality of scarcity. Do you think that there's not enough out there? Do you think that maybe there's not enough reputation to go around? Or do you have a scarcity around autonomy? Or do you have a scarcity around winning or being able to achieve? Usually our fears are around a sense of scarcity. So can you get to more of an abundant state where you know that there's not scarcity around this, there's abundance, and it's simply going for what you want? And so just that self-recognition can sometimes be enough to motivate a shift, to get away from the stick and go toward the carrot.
It's my personal perspective, and I don't know if you agree with this, Antonia, but this is my opinion. So don't take this as fact. This is my opinion. You talked about predators and this idea that a healthy fear of predators is good, or having a fear of predators is good. Some fears are good. And I agree. I think if you're in a dark alley in a major city and you're in a bad part of town, having an awareness or a healthy fear of somebody could hurt you is probably a good idea. But a lot of our fears, and in particular, the fears in this model of power, affiliation, and achievement, to me seem like they're rooted in old, ancient programming in our minds, things we had to be fearful of at one time. So, for example, a power away from person, the fearing of being controlled by others, probably harkens back to a time period where humans were enslaved and controlled by others in a lot of ways. And that really, I know that still happens on the planet, but in our developed world, if you're listening to this podcast, the likely chance of you being in a slavery environment or being controlled, literally chained up under someone else's control, is probably not likely for you. So it's an ancient fear that we have, that we've carried with us into our modern world, that still has control over our psyche, that we don't really have to deal with so much in our modern world. The fear of getting kicked out of the tribe and dying, being isolated, being embarrassed, and we're removed from that 200-person tribe in the jungle somewhere, or on the Great Plains of Africa or something, a long time ago, was a legitimate fear. If you didn't have your tribe, you didn't have anything. You couldn't hunt, you couldn't get food, you couldn't get supplies, you were isolated, you'd probably die. That doesn't happen in our world. We're not thrown out of tribes literally. It's figuratively thrown out. We're censured or embarrassed. So that fear is something that's, again, tied to old ancient programming. And fear of failure, fear of not being able to make a bow and arrow correctly or hunt effectively. And now, again, we're going to maybe be kicked out of the tribe, or we're going to lose our privileges in the tribe. Again, that's rooted in a fear that probably harkens back to something very ancient for us.
Or starve.
Yeah. Yeah. We can't make the tool we need to go hunt. So now we're going to not be able to get the food we need. We can't fish or hunt. And a lot of these fears, I think, are rooted in old programming. Just like when you step up to give a speech in front of people, you start sweating and you might feel like your heart's beating really fast. You feel like you're literally about to die. It's some of these old fears that still are in that lizard brain part of us that have some control over us. And I think that's why we say that there can be healthy expressions of the away from motivators, but often if we're really working on ourselves and we want to get to a more positive experience, it's again, my personal experience, or my personal opinion, I should say, and I think you share this as well because you just mentioned it, Antonia, that moving toward motivator is a better option.
Yeah, I agree. One more thing before we wrap this podcast up is I'd like to mention too that there's another model of motivation that we'll probably focus in on a future podcast. And we mentioned it briefly, I think, in the ENTP podcast. But there was a really interesting book written by Daniel Pink called Drive, where they talk about some of the newest, most advanced information in neuroscience and psychology about motivation. He talks about 3 motivators that are prime movers. I think he calls it like the trifecta of motivation. And those are autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And so they kind of tie in. They're not a beautiful tie-in. It's not like a direct overlay for this model. But autonomy, mastery, and purpose are also primary movers. And they're some of the healthiest expressions of motivation. And you can kind of loosely see how they could tie in with this. Autonomy being a way of a very healthy form of the power piece. Mastery, a very healthy form of achievement. And purpose could arguably be a very healthy form of the affiliation piece. So there's more to talk about on this subject. We'll probably end up talking about that motivation trifecta in a future podcast. Just know that this is not as like a complete model of motivation. There are other motivators out there. And of course, how they show up is going to be different depending upon your personality type. An ENTP achievement person is going to look different than an ISFP achievement person. So they are going to change a little bit based on type, but see if you can identify it. See if you can figure out which one you have a tendency to gravitate towards. And is there any way that you can use it for self-motivation? We've talked about in the past this concept of throwing your hat over the fence, meaning that you force yourself to do something. When you throw your hat over the fence, now you have to climb over the fence to go get your hat. But make sure the hat is the right hat. Make sure it's if you're an achievement person, make sure it's an achievement hat that you throw over the fence. And the same thing with power and affiliation. So
come over to personalityhacker.com. Let us know which motivator you think you are primarily using and how it shows up for you. Maybe a quick little story or expression of that in your life, or maybe somebody you've interacted with. We'd love to hear about it, personalityhacker.com. You can also join our community of like minds over at facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack, HACK.
If you like what you hear, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you're feeling a sense of reciprocity, please feel free to leave a rating and review on iTunes. The more ratings and reviews we get consistently over time, the more they'll cross-promote us, the higher we go in the ratings chart, and it just overall does us a favor. So if you're feeling generous, magnanimous, and a sense of reciprocity, please feel free to leave a rating and a review.
Thanks for being a part of the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
We'll talk with you on the next episode.